as Thomas Merton says, like, hold all things in tension with each other inside of ourselves. I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about how to be full, to know God is to hold many different things at the same time and learn to live in peace with the fact that they don't always make sense together.
Welcome to the Etsy Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts. The line between what is sacred and what some may call secular or profane is famously difficult to navigate. Volumes have been written and argued over regarding where that line is or how to recognize it, how to communicate that line to others. My guest on this episode is songwriter and advocate Audrey Assad, whose work suggests that the real task might not be so much finding, navigating, and communicating a line between where God is and where God isn't, but instead sifting granularly through one's own human experience, an expectation and hope of discovering a multitude of divine moments and expressions, not all of which will agree with the others. That's a work my faith tradition calls discernment, and among the many admirable characteristics I think you'll discover in Audrey Assad during our conversation, perhaps most notably is that she is faithfully and generously discerning. Check it out. Did you go to college? Were you a college kid?
No, technically I went to one semester part-time in 2002.
Okay.
A year late. I took a year off and then I tried it, and I was doing really well in my 3 classes, but it was expensive, and my parents did not save it. I mean, they were not able to pay for college. So, and I didn't want to go to school for music, so there wasn't really a lot of scholarships that I could get as far as, I mean, music would have been the obvious place for me to get scholarships.
Why didn't you want to go to school for music then?
I guess I just felt like if I wanted to try it out as a job first and see, because I felt like I was interested in songwriting, and performing at that point. Right around that time is when I started being interested in it. And I thought, well, let me take a year and try it out. And maybe in that time I'll have some more clarity about what I want to do. Cause I wasn't interested in teaching music, and I wasn't interested in being like a concert pianist, and I had taken classical lessons for many years, but I was practicing for 4 or 5 hours a day, and just wasn't me. It wasn't for me. I wasn't good enough anyway. But it was just eating up my life. And so I decided to just try, a different approach. And it ended up just taking off so quickly for me that I never had a chance to go back to school. But I wanted to be an English major or an English literature major, but I never ended up going back.
Well, I was an English major, and I can go ahead and tell you it's not a whole lot to look up to. It was
well, I mean, I enjoyed it. That's the thing. I was like, I really wanted to do it because I was like, I would enjoy this so much, but I don't know what it's going to do for me in the real world, really. Unfortunately, I wish it was more. I wish a college degree was an assurance of more things, but anymore, if you don't have a master's degree, it's kind of like it's very difficult to get hired anywhere that you want to be. And so I think I thought, well, if I wanted it badly enough, I would go and do this whole thing. But I really want to try music out. So
during that 2 year stretch between the year off and then trying music out or trying college out, were you thinking music as a career? I mean, you started playing piano when you were 2, something like your son's age, right?
Yeah.
So were you thinking I wanted to somehow do music professionally in some way, shape, or form, or was it we'll see how this thing plays out? What was going on in your brain?
In that gap year, I was working at one of my dad's companies because obviously nepotism, but or family business. I mean, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But I worked, at his insurance company, and I was just kind of figuring things out. But I didn't start thinking about music until I was at school. So I was at college, and then I actually had an encounter with somebody who said to me, well, have you ever thought about leading worship and we need help? And I was like, no, I've never thought about that in my life. And, but I started helping out at this Bible study that he ran, and he was another student at school. And, it kind of went from there. It's just, it's funny. Yeah. I didn't start writing songs till that semester. And I guess for whatever reason, being there, I think just knowing how expensive it was and feeling unsure of how to proceed with school made me kind of really start getting serious about figuring out what it was I even wanted to do. And so maybe going to school was what I needed to get that clarity,
Well, for a lot of folks, that ends up being what at least the first couple years of an undergraduate degree does anyways, is sort of it pressures you into a position in which like you are honestly evaluating what you care about, or you discover it. And you're like, oh gosh, here's the thing I had no idea I actually cared about or knew anything about. And now it's like, I want to spend $40,000 a year to figure it out.
Yeah.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Lord, be all else to me save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night. Waking or sleeping, thy presence my life.
You grew up in New Jersey.
Yeah. And then when I was 18, my father relocated us to West Palm Beach.
Oh, wow.
And opened a branch of his insurance company there, and then opened 2 restaurants while we were living there. And so I worked for him in New York City when I was in high school, just kind of occasionally. It was more for experience, and I didn't really do much. I was like an errand girl,
Yeah.
I was homeschooled, so I went to the city and worked a couple days a week. And then I moved to West Palm, and I worked at the insurance company, and then I worked at the restaurants as both a hostess and a bartender. My brothers were both servers there. We all had some experience with his various.
That's pretty cool.
I think I've worked for 4 of my dad's companies in the past.
That's so great. Yeah. I worked for my dad for I was 2 or 3 months one summer years and years ago. It was like second or third job, and he was starting this consolidation thing for airlines, and he had me in a room with a bunch of stamps and envelopes. It was like this is literally one of those you had one job stories. So I'm in the room with a bunch of stamps and envelopes, and he comes in, and I've just been stamping things and not paying attention, and all the stamps are sort of crooked, and some of the postage is wrong. He was like, okay, so we can't have you do these things. What can we? Here's a broom. It was like, okay, you're bad at this stamping thing. Working for your dad can be a little on the embarrassing side, especially as a first job.
Sure can. Oh my gosh, it's so true.
I hear the music ringing. It finds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing?
So you have something came up recently in which you were talking about stuff happening, and I think I'm gonna get this right. Actually, I've never heard the word said out loud, but your side project, am I gonna get it right when I call it Lev?
Yeah.
So this is you're 4 or 5 years into that project. Can you is that about right?
Yeah, about 4 years. About 5 years actually.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you talk about the difference between what you're doing with Lev and what you're doing as a solo artist? Why 2 projects? What's the difference? Not necessarily sonically, there's a significant difference, but why are they those 2 things? How'd that happen?
Sure. Well, the project was sort of conceived when I was still on a record label in Nashville and was growing absolutely miserable in that situation. And I was on a tour that was losing money. I was just kind of at my wit's end on several levels. And one of the issues that was kind of going on was that I was feeling extremely creatively stifled at the label. And I think it was one of those situations where I felt very stuck because, I mean, I had signed a contract and there's legal, recourse for the label if I decide to venture outside that or do something that isn't agreed upon,
Mm-hmm.
by the team. But I had quickly realized in that relationship that I was not the type of person that they were looking for, the type of artist. I was not willing or able to be what they wanted me to become.
Which
and
is
so,
what? Like what would that have looked like?
Oh man, all kinds of things. Well, first of all, I wanted to write with actual honesty, and that was always met with a challenge. And for me, that looked like I wanted to write about grief or doubt in a way that didn't resolve. And that was really not met kindly or with openness. And then the other, so that was one big issue.
Like you can write about the storm so long as the final verse is all majors and hey, you're going to get through this kind of a thing.
You have to tip God's poker hand and be like, but it's okay. He has the full house. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And I was like, but I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that. And so why should I say that? And they were like, who are you? It was just, why are you making Christian music? And I'm like, I don't know. I just, because I'm a Christian and I'm making music. And so so that was a big issue and a constant kind of stress point for me. Now I have to say they tried really hard because the people I was working with were really great people and they really believed in me and they wanted to make it work. But ultimately, it just wasn't a fit. But that was one of the big issues. And then the other one was that I had a very, I guess, pointed interest in things like the finances of the situation. And so I wanted to be involved in discussions of how much we spent where. Yeah. And that was not met with openness either. And I think it quickly... whether I didn't intend for this, but it kind of drove the relationship into the ground that I insisted on being kept abreast of marketing expenses.
So maybe is there some sort of a link there between you had worked for your dad in all these spaces and it's family business, and so that some of that stuff's on the table anyways, and so you're just kind of used to knowing, it's not my business, it's your business, but if I'm going to be involved, I would really rather know where all the numbers are going.
Yeah. And I think that was not the typical case with artists that signed these contracts. And really there were a couple of things that happened financially where I was appalled by the expense because I knew it was recoupable and I knew that it would never measure out in my favor,
Right.
And as I became aware of those things happening, one time I saw a bill at a restaurant on a trip we were on, and it absolutely shocked me because it was multiple thousands of dollars.
Wow.
And I was like, I can't make that back. This is ludicrous.
And that was coming back to you? It was like a recoupable expense?
And it was on a project that I knew. It was kind of an ancillary project, but we required us to go out of town. And so I knew what that meant, and I thought, you know what? I'm never gonna be an artist who sells millions of records. So I can't have my label spending money like I'm that person. And so I basically started challenging them on things like that, and it just wasn't gonna work. Yeah. I mean, and you know what? I have to give them so much credit because I went to them with all these concerns eventually in a more official way. And it took them a little while, but after a while, they just let me out of my deal.
You're kidding? They just dropped it?
No, they dropped it. They didn't renew my option. Once I kind of went to them and said, here's the deal. I can't do it this way. And these are the things I want to change. And if they don't change, I can't. I'm just going to stop.
Yeah.
And they, went back and forth with me about it. And so in the midst of all that happening, while we were still going back and forth about all this stuff, they pulled all of the support out from under me that was there. We were in the middle of a record cycle. I started writing songs, and the songs that I wrote are what eventually turned into this project. And so I basically was making music as this other iteration of myself because I was in limbo at the record label. And so, so that's how it kind of was birthed.
Lev was sort of a way, like you had a desire, I don't even know if you had like specific songs, but you had a desire to do something that landed outside the parameters that you were given, and it got sort of squeezed out by them trying to make you or wanting you to be someone you weren't. It was almost like a protest work.
It was like I wanted to take some time to ask myself, okay, if no one constrained you at all, what would you, and speaking to myself, what would you want to say? And, so I wrote a bunch of songs, and I ended up sending them to the people I worked with, and they basically were like, yeah, we can't do anything with this. Yeah. So thankfully I got to be freed from the deal. And then I immediately started working on making my own independent records as a solo artist and working on this other project. And so I've been doing the two things for the last, it's been 5 years of working on Lev, 4 years of working on independent worship music. And Lev is kind of finally starting to have legs now. It's a new artist essentially. So It takes a while, but it's kind of finding its place in the world. So
does the audience overlap pretty significantly, or do you find there are people
come? At the moment, it does. Okay. At the moment, it does, but I say at the moment because we're about to release new music, and I'm not sure if they're going to overlap as much, because I think the themes are changing. The music is changing quite a bit as well, because it was sort of more of a cinematic orchestral pop thing at first, and now we've gone all the way over to the EDM world because because Seth and I, Seth produced that first project with me, and that first record we did. And as we did that, we kind of quickly were sort of looking at each other and saying, this just feels like a band. It doesn't feel like a producer-artist relationship.
Right.
And so we joined forces. Well, Seth is a DJ. I mean, it's what he does. He makes pop, house music. And so the music has evolved quite a bit. And honestly, this time around, we wrote a lot of songs about some really, I guess, darker themes, for lack of a better term. And so I'm curious to see if that overlap will kind of become less of a thing. At the moment, it's almost all my fans that wanted something different. But I'm curious to see what will happen when we release the new stuff, for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine insofar as, you tend to publicly, in your relationship with folks, which I'd love to talk about your relationship with your fan base in general, but you tend to open the door to those conversations, and it seems like you've actually kind of curated enough of a cultural space in which your people would be willing to go with you for the most part into, like, if it's in your heart, they're probably somewhat at least aware of it and just waiting for different expressions. At least that's the way it seems to me. Not everyone can do that, right? I mean, not everyone can, especially if you've been trying to hide any of that stuff, and then suddenly like, here's this really honest work. And you're like, Garth Brooks, what are you doing, and why are you wearing eye makeup? It's sort of that moment.
Give up, so I am learning to let go of you. Learning to let go of you. Yeah, I am learning
talking about sort of Lev as a project, and then there is the independent Audrey Assad stuff, and the two work to some degree in different spaces, but which begs this really interesting question about that division, at least in the way, like as a listener, they're very clearly different projects with different emphases thematically. Is the difference mostly thematic for you, or is the difference like on the one hand you kind of have the sacred music thing happening, and on the other hand you have this more pop oriented stuff? Like for you, like are they emotionally different experiences? Is it like you don't really want to cross the streams in that sort of Ghostbusters spiritual way? Like
right.
Like can you talk about that tension a little bit?
Yeah. So I think part of the distinction is necessary. I should say this. The distinction for me between the two projects is partially necessary because I don't really make Christian folk or like pop music. I make, at this point, very kind of worship oriented, somewhat corporate, but also sort of, I call it soundtracks for prayer. You know, that's kind of what I feel like I do as Audrey Assad. And so,
you mean insofar as like, there's like a utility to that. So the way you just described it is like, it's not like this is not for a particular form of entertainment. Tell me if I
catharsis for me.
Oh, interesting.
Really, I mean, not that it's never cathartic to make it, but that
you're not making it for the point of catharsis.
Reason I make it. No,
interesting.
I make it. It is partially there. Like there's obviously catharsis in it because it's music and because I'm being myself. But I think I am conscious of what my goal has been, which is to make what I consider hopefully a fresh contribution to the canon of music that the church is using. And so that's not really the place for me to scratch my itches or, you know, not that there's ever I guess I'll just say it this way. It's not that there's never an opportunity for lamenting or for challenging the church or for any of that. But when it comes to like me wanting to write a song, let's say about, you know, like one we have coming out soon as Lev is about my experience with someone who is very sexually aggressive towards me.
Right.
That's not a song that belongs thematically on, you know, an Audrey Assad record at this point. Sure. And so Lev has been a place for me to sit there and go, I have nobody to serve with this beyond myself at the moment. And I know, you know, I'll discover when the song has been released into the world who it's for, but I don't have to think about them right now.
Okay.
You know, this is like a place for me to just explore my interior world, and that others, you know, whoever it's for, I'll find out eventually.
So you have more of a sense of audience for your solo independent stuff, whereas Lev is still really deeply personal. And it maybe doesn't sound like it's really had a landing place among a tribe of people per se yet.
Right. It's kind of just, I think, about to be at a place where that will be more, it'll be interesting. You know, we'll be, because we're about to release a single, which I can't tell you the date yet because we haven't publicly announced it.
Right. But
we're releasing new music, and we, you know, are doing this with a label. And we're doing it with PR and management and all the stuff that we didn't have the first time around. So I think it's about to change, and it may be less of a pure place eventually. We'll have to figure that out and navigate that just like every artist. But at the moment, it's kind of been like us drinking water. It's very, very pure and very cathartic and very, very helpful to us as humans. And so, you know, Audrey Assad, even if I were to start that all over, I mean, because it, like, I didn't do worship music at the beginning, but I did make that shift on purpose, partially because my experience of mixing worship and pop was really negative. I didn't, I felt like I was never being myself. It was always a little bit less than myself because I was always toning something down, and it just didn't feel
fascinating,
realistic.
So what hit me as I was paying attention and going back and forth between what you do as a, you know, creating more like liturgical music or music, and the way you said it earlier, it's actually, I don't want to go back to what you said after the interview and listened to, because you talked about, to some degree, creating music with a sense of its user, with a sense of its use, and not just like, I'm just creating tools. I mean, there's some catharsis there. It was just really that's a fascinating way to say it. But this line, like, I think there is this really interesting, it's not a line, but it's sort of like a tension or a balancing act or something, a rhythm between, I don't know if you grew up on any hip hop, but I remember LL Cool J, like forever ago, had the one of the jams on this record of his was this like prayer song at the end of this album, and it felt like this weird left turn at first, and years later, someone handed me a book by a guy named Alexander Schmemann. I don't know if Schmemann, it's a household name. And he writes, he says, the world is a fallen world because it's fallen away from the awareness that God is all in all. And even the religion of this fallen world cannot save or redeem it, for it has accepted the reduction of God into an area called sacred, as opposed to the world as profane. It's accepted the all-embracing secularism, which attempts to steal the world away from God, which is such that last line is so provocative, attempts to steal the world away from God. But I mean, I feel that pull to the sort of religion trying to steal the world away from God. And so that, like, watching you navigate these two aspects of your creative expression with Lev and with your independent work, really, like, it's a really interesting, you're someone you were actively seeking that out. You're actually like trying to navigate the space between there. And
I'm trying to baptize all things, and I mean, I think things have different purposes. Look, like liturgical music is, like you said, it's music with a use, and that's not a bad thing. But when we fail to be able to, as Thomas Merton says, like, hold all things in tension with each other inside of ourselves. I'm paraphrasing, but he talks about how to be full, to know God is to hold many different things at the same time and learn to live in peace with the fact that they don't always make sense together. And I think most people who grow up in like a fundamentalist culture, which I did, we sort of go like sequestering and communes are always the answer, because the more we can kind of just stake out our territory, then the more we know that we're fighting for God and all that kind of thing. And what a lot of times music is a casualty in that whole situation, because, I was raised in a church that was very against sort of listening to anything with a backbeat kind of, it wasn't, I didn't even hear, I mean, we were so conservative in that way, in that regard, that we didn't listen to praise and worship music. So I never even heard praise and worship music till I was probably in my late high school years, because that was even anathema, and, because it was modern and because there were drums and all of that. Right. And so I think as part of my working out of that whole experience as a young person is me coming to that understanding of realizing that God is not limited to what we call sacred, is to try to baptize other things that I think have been called anathema before. And I don't think that they are. I'm fully aware that there will be probably a significant segment of my current audience who cannot see what I'm doing with Lev and what we're about to release as part of that mission, but that doesn't really deter me from it at all.
A metaphor in man in the west. I felt a strange fire in my chest, like moonshine in the morning light of the sun. I never saw him coming.
And when you talk about things that I love the phrase, by the way, that trying to baptize all things. One of the spaces, or one of the things, the cultural areas I see you attempting to baptize, you and along with a lot of folks, is the world of politics, and you among a number of other folks have gotten kind of punched in the throat with with people all on Twitter or Facebook otherwise saying basically stick with music. Like we're comfortable with you over there. Like you're doing this thing over here. Do the music and leave the politics to the people that we can actively dislike without having any emotional connection with them.
Exactly.
Which is such a fascinating deal. Like there really is this thing. It's like, hey, I need you to stick with music. And what you're not saying when you say that is, I need you to be over here because I actually like you. And I need what you're creating. So I don't want to have a disagreement with you that forces me to, like you just said from Merton, like hold something in tension. I really don't want to try to hold you in tension. I want to be able to just hate politics and politicians and like my musicians over here. And like, I love watching this thing break down in the sense of like, you don't get to do that. You actually have to fall in love with some politicians and believe like, man, she's really up to some great stuff. And she's probably also up to some stuff that you don't like, but you have to kind of, treat her as a human, and you have to treat your artists as human. You had this moment.
Who is this her to whom you're referring?
Just anybody, you had this moment, if you don't mind.
Must not be named.
On Twitter, if you're okay with me reading this thread of yours, and this is from today. You said, it's really starting to hit home to me that many Christians see the church as more of a country club than a hospital. Starting to hit home as in it started to hit home for me when Mike Brown was shot. And now my people are viewed as barely human, and you're talking specifically about Syrians.
About Arabs, yeah.
About Arabs, as barely human by some people whose God became Middle Eastern human and died cruciform. Look, I've tried not to stay here. I've actually tried to leave. I've actually tried not to be a Christian anymore. But I love the church, it turns out. It's the thorn in my side. It's a great line. It's the thorn in my side and the pillow under my head, and my mother and my drunk uncle. Some tell me all day I don't belong here with my suspect politics or my disappointing lack of Thomism, but I'm staying with you. Can you talk just for a few minutes, if you don't mind, and go wherever you want to go with this? Your last few months, up to 6 or 8 months, has been really trying and difficult as you've been in the political sphere. Can you talk a little bit about your experience, where you're coming from, and why it's personal?
Thanks for the great question. And I'm glad it's funny. I was like, what's he going to read? I was like, he must have checked that like an hour before we talked.
I did.
Because I just tweeted that.
I know.
I grew up in a church background where we didn't vote and we didn't engage politically. And actually there were some really great things about that, because what I didn't grow up with is our church being, kind of like bastardized by political
you were Brethren, is that right?
Yeah, Plymouth Brethren.
Yeah.
And so the advantage to that was that I did grow up free from endorsing political candidates and getting embroiled in the whole, like, there's a Christian government and we are it, and, if you're not Republican, you're not Christian. Like, I never grew up with any of that. We were definitely, there were a lot of secret hardcore Republicans in our midst, but we never talked about it at church. That was not a thing that we did. And so I'll never forget this little sweet Egyptian lady that went to my church, came to church one day with a picture with Bill Clinton that she had gotten taken because she saw him in public somewhere. And she was so over the moon about it because he was the president at the time.
Yeah.
And everyone was sort of like, how dare you show up with that, but we didn't campaign. We didn't do any of that. So there was, a detachment of some sort from the political arena for me growing up. Well, as I left that behind, I was in my early 20s when I kind of left the Plymouth Brethren for good, in the sense that I left participating in it. I can never leave it as my context. It just is what it is. Mm-hmm. I started to just, of course, sort of go on a journey of self-discovery. And I think that's pretty common for kids of my age anyway. No matter where you come from, you start, in your late teens, early 20s, to start to ask yourself, like, who am I? Am I my parents? Am I my church? Yeah. I started to go on this sort of journey of self-discovery. And so one of the areas that I've discovered in my own personal world being very important and very sort of insistent in my own interior life is that I value politics. I don't want to value them. I would love nothing better than to completely unplug from having to care about policy and politicians and executive orders and, local whatever, because no matter how you slice it, it's always going to be a mix of good and bad. And it's incredibly complicated and incredibly tense and incredibly touchy.
So you and I have a mutual friend in Sarah Groves, who one of my favorite lines in all of songwriting history says, "It's too heavy to carry, but impossible to leave." And that's what you're describing. Exactly, I don't want to have to care about this, but I can't not.
No, because the thing is, and this is where I think I am today, and what I sort of discovered within myself, over the last however many years, is that the kingdom of God, for better or for worse, has to overlap with the kingdom of this world right now. It's just how it is. I mean, it's always been that way. Jesus was living in a time of, persecution and all kinds of, famine and poverty and diseases and all of these things that we deal with now.
Yeah.
And he both, he both preached something that transcends that.
Yeah.
And he descended into it. It was this both and that is sort of impossible, but it's what we must follow if we desire to be followers of Jesus, because he did that and was ultimately executed by the state. Now, some people take issue with that because it was the Jews who cried out for his execution. But what I like to look at is the fact that at that point, Pilate and the Jews were interacting in a way that suggested that their community, he was pacifying them. So that says to me that there was an engagement level that was present before Jesus ever came along. And I'm not a scholar. I'm totally, I'm reading into the text what seems obvious, but I'm just disclaimer. I'm not a scholar of the scripture, but so I guess I'll say this. I wish that Christians could afford to completely disengage, but I grew up in a world where we did that. And what it turned into was navel gazing and insular commune style life. And I don't see that as the call of the average Christian. I think that there are places in the world for people like religious orders to exist in a sort of space of prayer and intercession. I see them as sort of these like, almost like outposts of prayer in the desert. But by and large, most of us are living in the world working. We have neighbors who are affected by policies that we might ourselves enact and help to put into place. So it's like, you can't live in the world and just decide, at least in my opinion, you as a decent human being with a conscience, I have to be conscious of how my voting and how my politics affects other human beings.
Yes.
And their liberties and their life and their comfort and their provision, provision for their needs and all of that. So I guess the way I see it is like, as much as I'd wish that the kingdom of God didn't overlap with the kingdom of man, it just does. And if I want to further the kingdom of God, then I have to at least engage with the kingdoms of man, or else, what am I doing?
Right.
And it's not something I enjoy, honestly. I'm like, I'm very fascinated by politics, but I don't talk about it because it gives me some kind of like, I don't know, thrill. It's not
right.
that at all. But I believe in, I'll leave it with this. I believe in the interreactivity of all people and all things. And so what I mean by that is that this is a very Madeleine L'Engle concept. I'm totally ripping her off.
Yeah.
But I believe that I am tied to every other human being by an inextricably complex web of events and decisions and choices. And so I can't know how every movement of mine in this world is going to affect every other human being, but I can think about it. I can care about it, and I can do my best to make decisions and vote and enact policies and do local advocacy work to the best of my ability to influence the web for better. I mean, that's all I can do. That's all any of us can do. And so at the end of the day, that's really all the task that I give myself.
the fear of having nothing, from a life of worldly passions. Deliver me, oh God, from the need to be understood.
Your father, I mean, you describe on your website, your father is a Syrian refugee.
Mm-hmm.
So this ends up kind of landing for you personally.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about your responsibility. Can you talk about sort of your experience? Like you're a public figure, you're having conversations publicly, but you're having to also kind of carry this really interesting tension of not making it, how should I say, you don't want to necessarily make it about you personally, but at the same time, it's not just an idea because it actually deeply affects your personal life.
Right. Yeah, that's been a real area of confusion for me, honestly, is how do I leverage my story in the right ways and not in ways that are, I don't even want to use my own dad as a prop, you know? And so it is something that I have to constantly be sort of discerning, you know, how to engage with the particular issue at hand of Syrian refugees, which is sort of a more prescient, is that the word I'm looking for? I guess like a more imminent issue is Syria in particular. So the recent, you know, and by the time this comes out, this will have been a few months in the past, so who knows what will have happened. But, you know, the recent executive order banning Syrian refugees indefinitely, presumably because, or purportedly because we need to, like, vet in what is it?
More extremely vet.
Process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that event and that direction that the government that we're under right now is taking, you know, is personal because I can't help but be affected emotionally by watching what is happening, not only in Syria, but then here on the ground. And one of I think the most difficult things about it for me has not been that we're going to revamp our vetting process. Although I hear myself say that and I go like, fuck, it doesn't have to be difficult for me. It's difficult for those people over there who are just trying to get somewhere safe. So that's not hard for me, but it's just, I don't know. I can't even think about it. But the hardest thing for me emotionally, me, the person, the individual, has been the reaction of many sort of Christian voices to Trump in general, and then to this executive order. It's kind of illuminating some things because so I said in my tweets that you read that some people view my people as barely human. And I really believe that. I think there are people that I hear from on a regular basis on social media, and you can call them trolls all day, but the reality is like they're Baptists sitting in pews somewhere, or they're Catholics sitting in pews somewhere, you know,
family.
And it's tweeting this at me. They're people, family. You know? Yeah. And they truly view Arabs as like inherently more violent or inherently more prone to you name it. And I have been very shocked by that. But I shouldn't be shocked by it at this point because it's actually a really common viewpoint, unfortunately. And anyway, I think what I am concerned with at this point is trying to be a voice that turns the tide in the evangelical world in particular, because Catholics, there's a lot of like hardcore Republican Catholics, but honestly, the Catholic Church as an organization has been a beautiful witness recently, in writing to President Trump about healthcare and writing to him about this ban. So, but when I think of the evangelical world at large anyway, you know, I want to be a voice of, I hope, reason, and I also hope of, you know, inspiring empathy with Syrians and with Arabs in general, because honestly, at the end of the day, you know, we can't, like I said, we can sort of do our best to influence the web of connections between human beings, you know, for better and make it stronger and make it better and safer. But there's going to be a lot of things that go on here that a lot of us have no control over. So what I hope to do is to be an Arab publicly, to share my father's story and my story in such a way that it inspires empathy, because empathy is going to be the only thing that ever creates any hospitality in this world, or positive change politically. Because in order to change the world politically or in any way for the better of your neighbor, you have to be empathizing with your neighbor.
Well, they have to be human. I mean, you end up motivated.
They have to be humans too. Yeah.
Ideas last for only so long, but a relationship is constantly renewable and renewing.
Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's like, let me, I guess, put forth my Arab identity in such a way that is aiming to build empathy in the world. And if I can do that, then I think I'll be dying, I hope, with a clear conscience about that. I think there's other things I can do, of course, as a citizen, and I am doing those things. I mean, I regularly engage politically at local and national levels, but I think this is, to me, the more long-lasting kingdom work is to try to build empathy between the church and Arabs, which just sounds horrible, but they have a strained relationship there and here. So, just trying to help reconcile that, I guess. Yeah.
And in this, the last stretch of time, well, actually, I'll back up and say this. I messaged you a while back, maybe close to a year ago, and talked about your inheritance project, and that it had been a lifeline for me in a bunch of ways during a really, really, a stressful and turbulent 2015, and like coming into 2016. It was a gift, and I wonder if there is, I wonder if there's music or art that is, in a sense, kind of saving your life right now. Do you have like musical, artistic lifelines now? Like you're going to things that are breathing life into you, or you're feeling supported, or you're finding some kind of that empathetic connection? Are there musical, artistic lifelines for you right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as of a couple days ago, there's a record that came out by the Brilliants called All Is Not Lost that I have found incredibly medicinal, I guess. It's brand new to me, but already I'm, finding so much home inside it. And then in more, recent months, I'm looking at this is so fun for me to look at like my top played things.
Sweet.
It's, I've loved, the new John Legend record.
Oh, great.
And, because, it's really, I've listened to him for a long time. I'm not like a super fan. I don't want to say that, but I've really loved him for a long time. And this is one of the first times I've heard him. It's called Love Me Now. And I've heard him.
That's the
address
single. The record,
issues.
what's the record? Darkness?
Is it Darkness and Light. Yeah.
Darkness and Light. Yeah.
Darkness and Light. Sorry. And yeah, he is addressing social issues on this record in a way that I think is incredibly poetic and beautiful and kind of inspiring. And so I've really loved that. I'm trying to think of what else I listened. Oh, so there's actually a record called Invisible by Leland. Do you remember them? They used to be on Sparrow Records a long time ago, and they're not anymore, but they put out a record called Invisible in 2016 that I think I wore out. If you can wear out a digital file, I wore it out.
You tried.
Yeah, I tried. I just certainly gave it my best shot. Because it's kind of this, it's kind of unusual for me to be that attached to a worship record, but it was kind of like prayers I couldn't pray at that time and wanted to so desperately. And the melodies are incredible and the music is great. It's a very different, it's a directional change for them, but I've really loved that album. And then I honestly return all the time to the same wells recently too. Like I listened to a ton of Paul Simon because
he's the best. He's so great.
Yeah, he is. He is the best. I love him. I listen to him all the time. I listen to still crazy after all these years.
Mm-hmm.
And Graceland, like, so much. I mean, Graceland in particular, I think, has been a real refuge for me. And by the way, there's a great documentary called Under African Skies on, digital platforms about that record. It's incredible. And he meets with, this is such a tangent, but he meets with the former leader of the ANC, which was enforcing the cultural boycott on South Africa when he went there, made it, and they meet together and discuss all of that. And it's really enlightening and helpful and interesting. But so, I think I have a diverse pool of stuff I listen to, but those are some things that have been home for me.
That's really good.
Recently. And
it's interesting for you to hear you say, because it was one of the questions I was going to ask earlier about, like, sort of your connection with music, and particularly music that might be more like church oriented or liturgically oriented, is, if you still have experiences with music in that space, or as someone who creates it, you end up having sort of a distance, which is, you communicate a little bit of both. Like, it sounds like it's a particular moment for you when you, like, really connect with a church oriented song, or sort of like what folks will call a worship song, but that in general, there's a little bit of the kind of, at least in my experience, like, I'm listening to stuff like that, and I've kind of got my shop talk hat on.
Tough. Yeah. And it's like, you've seen behind the curtain, and how much of an industry it is, and you're part of it. And so it's kind of a weird relationship for sure. But every once in a while something comes out that I'm just so compelled by, even if I don't always relate to what it's saying. Just the spirit of it, the music, the, ineffable things about it. They're very valuable. And I think Christians should make music, even if I wouldn't have said this 6 years ago, probably. I think Christians should make music that is overt about what they believe, in as much as it's like, why shouldn't they? Like, they should be who they are. And for me, the difficulty with it has always resulted from when those things are actually corrupted by money and by greed. But I don't have a problem. I think it's beautiful when Christians talk about, in their music, about the God that they follow and the church that they love. I think that's beautiful. And when I sense, like, a purity in that, I get very into it. I think it's beautiful. Yeah. I've always loved Leland. I think they're great, but this record is so beautiful.
Well, hey, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks for being flexible.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening. You can follow up with Audrey Assad by visiting audreyassad.com. That's actually got 2 S's there. AudreyAssad, audreyassad.com. Her side project, Lev, is available at levmusic.com. In fact, she was kind enough to let us use music from both her solo work and from her band work, Lev, for this episode. If you jump to atcpodcasts.com, we're featuring a video from the most recent Lev release entitled Collateral Damage. It's a fascinating and beautiful song. I think you're really going to like it, along with links to albums and books referenced during our conversation. Lastly, if you dig what we're up to, please leave us a positive review at iTunes and share this episode with a friend or 8. And if you'd like to support this podcast, you can jump over to patreon.com and search my name, Justin McRoberts, or just go right to the address, which is patreon.com/Justin McRoberts, and back up what we're doing here. Until next time.